So our next speaker is Dr. Min Jun, who's going to hook himself up with the microphone here. Min is a postdoctoral fellow in the Division of Nephrology Research Group. He is mentored by Dr. Brenda Hemmelgarn, and Min is going to speak to us today about beyond the world of randomized controlled trials.
I'll let that sink in for a couple seconds. So if you've seen the Matrix movies, this man standing behind me is going to be pretty familiar to you. This is Morpheus offering Neo, who's the main protagonist of the movies, a choice between the blue pill and the red pill. Now, without going into too much detail, as I don't want to ruin it for people who haven't seen the movies, perhaps I will anyway. What Neo does, without perhaps rushing into a particular decision at this point, is that he rushes for the red pill, backtracking a little bit. If Neo takes the blue pill, his life as he knows it continues on. But if he chooses the red pill, he gets to stay in Wonderland and find out a bit more about the Matrix. So he does go on and chooses the red pill, and the movie unfolds from then on. Now I want you to imagine this to be a clinical setting. Dr. Morpheus here offers a choice to Neo, who is the patient, say, for example, has chronic back pain. Perhaps this time around, Neo should take a moment and pause and figure out some of the questions or issues that he should potentially discuss with Dr. Morpheus here before he jumps into a decision about a treatment option. And these are some of the questions that he could potentially consider. Now, I don't mean for you to read all of those individually, but the point is that there is a process or even a list of considerations that a patient should consider along with their doctors before jumping into a decision about making a treatment option. And one of those important factors is at the top of the list, safety. And indeed, achieving this balance between safety and efficacy is something that many clinicians grapple with in the clinical setting. So the next question is then, with so much information out there, where do you source your reliable information from? What do you base your decision on? The hierarchy of evidence tells us at the top of the pyramid is our randomized controlled trials, or systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials. And indeed, randomized trials have been tremendously informative in terms of informing us of the efficacy of interventions going back to all the way back to the 1940s to the very first one. And I don't need to emphasize to a cardiovascular research audience the amazing or great advances that we've made over the last few decades in terms of cardiovascular medicine and disease. So then, without a doubt, randomized trials are indeed the gold standard when it comes to assessing efficacy of interventions. But is that the whole story? While they do have the reputation of being the gold standard when it comes to determining efficacies of interventions, they're certainly not without limitations. I don't mean to offend any trialists in the audience, but I'll take you some of the potential limitations of trials. First of all, they're very expensive to run. They can often cost millions of dollars to run or perform randomized trials. In some instances or contexts, it might be impossible or indeed inappropriate to run a randomized trial. Often trials aren't long enough and they fail to pick up certain safety events, particularly if they're rare or take a long time to develop. And perhaps most importantly, trial data has oftentimes limited generalizability outside the population that it was originally tested in. So for example, behind me is a list of the inclusion and the exclusion criteria of a typical trial. Again, I don't mean for you to read those individually, but the point is there are almost 5 times as many reasons to exclude a patient as opposed to reasons for including them. So then what happens is that people who go into a randomized trial often don't necessarily represent the broader population in which they were originally sampled from. So what are we missing here? What's the missing piece? I mean, how do we assess the effectiveness of an intervention? How do we address some of the limitations of randomized controlled trials? And the answer is large population-wide observational studies. And these study types have a number of advantages. First of all, they can include a vast number of participants with a very broad-ranging characteristics. They're relatively, compared to trials, fast to perform, quickly, they run quickly, cheaply, and also can pick up safety events which may not necessarily be picked up in a trial setting. So data linkage is now widely used as part of these study types. And indeed, within our own research group, this is what we use. And this is a schematic of our data sources in the Alberta Kidney Disease Network and the ICDC. Here we obtain different pieces of information from disparate or different sources of data by linking all of these data sources into one using a patient identifier number. We obtain information from the population registry, prescription drug information from Alberta Blue Cross, hospitalizations from inpatient encounters, and also laboratory data which is obtained from across the province. And so this ability to link data allows us to perform a range of different real-world-based studies, including this one here, which assesses the association between high-potency statins and rates of admission for acute kidney injury. The study itself really shows you of how powerful this type of study could be. And without going into the results themselves, I'll point some of the important factors behind this study. The study included over 2 million people across 7 different Canadian provinces, spanning actually a greater than a decade of study follow-up period, things which would simply be infeasible in a trial setting. In addition to those factors, randomized trials are important in hypothesis generating. That is, they help formulate an idea or a new hypothesis that can be tested in a randomized controlled trial setting. For example, warfarin, which is a blood thinner, is highly effective in reducing the risk of stroke in patients with atrial fibrillation, so much that the magnitude of benefit reaches up to 60%. So the risk-benefit ratio of warfarin is pretty much straightforward in the broader atrial fibrillation population, where the stroke benefit outweighs the risk of major bleeding. But among patients with kidney disease, the story is not so straightforward. Patients with kidney disease have reduced kidney function and already are at an elevated risk of bleeds, throwing off that risk-benefit ratio. So what we want to do is test whether indeed patients with reduced kidney function and atrial fibrillation receiving warfarin experienced increased rates of bleeds. And it seems like it appears that they do. The results behind me show that over worsening levels of kidney function on the y-axis from good to poor, on the x-axis are the rates of major bleeding. You can see that with progressively worsening kidney function, patients experience increased rates of major bleeding. And this is particularly apparent in the first 30 days of warfarin therapy, suggesting that among patients with reduced kidney function, it seems as though we need a randomized trial to test whether the same risk-benefit ratio applies in patients with reduced kidney function as it does with a broader atrial fibrillation population. Although, despite all the factors that I've mentioned in terms of advantages, observational studies are certainly not without limitations themselves. And we do need to be cognizant and we need to be aware of these factors, as highlighted by this article that was published in the BMJ, that suggests that observational studies should carry a health warning. So then, what do we need to do? How do we best take advantage of both the world of randomized trials and observational studies? The first is that we need to acknowledge that while trials certainly can't replace randomized trials, they do have a certain capacity to address at least some of the limitations of randomized trials. Secondly, we also need to acknowledge that observational studies themselves have certain limitations and indeed are prone to a range of biases that we need to be aware of and address appropriately using appropriate methodologies. So I know the idea is to try and avoid as much text as possible in these types of talks, but I thought this quote summarized the point I'm trying to get across beautifully. So it was published in the New England. It says, to understand everything we should know about a drug, we must do both kinds of research with rigor and humility. And if we do that, perhaps we can achieve some level of peace between the trialist and the pharmacoepidemiologist. Thank you.
Excellent, Min. Thank you very much. So we'll open this up for questions. While we're waiting for questions, Min, I'll ask you, where does the role of pragmatic randomized trials and registry trials fit in with this topic?
So it really seems to be the direction that people are going towards now, beyond randomized trials. So where a certain intervention is tested in a traditional trial and then gets tested again in what's called a quote-unquote effectiveness trial to see whether it actually, you see the same benefit in the community, say, for example. I think it's still a growing area. There are, for example, registry randomized trials where we try and maximize the use of all the information that's collected, but there are issues with privacy, whether we need to get individual consent from all of the patients that are included in the registry. So I think it's a growing field, but it's also at the same time an exciting field.
All right, thank you very much, Min. That was great.